The Aboriginal people of the Pilbara decided to do something about the situation that they found themselves in, and a great meeting at the Aboriginal Desert Lawmen was organised by Dooley Bin Bin, a senior lawman, Clancy McKenna, and over 200 people attended, some travelling thousands of kilometres from as far away as Halls Creek, Darwin and Alice Springs, on the eastern side of the Pilbara, where they could be away from the eyes of the squatters and the police. And there they sat in council for 6 weeks to discuss the shameful conditions that their people were living under, all through that central and western desert country. There were 23 languages spoken and 16 interpreters. And one white fella, the prospector Don McLeod, was invited to that meeting. He was one of the first white fellas to be born in Marble Bar, one of the most remote towns in Australia. He'd been invited because of the help he'd once shown to an Aboriginal elder who needed to be taken to hospital. None of the white fellas at the time would help to transport him, but McLeod took him as a matter of course and thought nothing more of it. His empathy was noted, and as a result, he was summoned to attend the Great Desert Council. The people discussed what they could do to improve the future for their children. Work and living conditions were appalling for all Aboriginal people at that time, but in the Pilbara, being so remote, it was particularly harsh and out of sight and out of mind. Aboriginal people were under the Native Administration Act, and they were virtually slaves in their own country. No wages, no housing, no freedom of movement, and meagre rations. McLeod was appointed executor, and the group became known as the Mob. They walked off the stations all across the Pilbara on the same day, and the squatters could not understand how they managed such a coordinated action. They waited until the war was over in 1946. For a long time before the strike, Dooley Bin Bin, a senior man of law, had travelled by foot and push bike through the Pilbara. He was an older man, and when the squatters inquired as to what that old man was doing on the station, they would say, oh, he's a poor old relation who's come to visit, he's probably going to finish up soon. But what Dooley was really doing was giving everyone a calendar and showing them the current date and instructing them to mark off every day with a red cross until they came to the day of the walk-off. Like I said, they waited until the Second World War ended. And in 1946, they went on strike, walked off sheep stations all across the northwest of Western Australia. Under the guidance of McLeod, Bin Bin and McKenna, the strike was well organised, and initially it stunned the authorities. All three were arrested and jailed and persecuted. Although the strike effectively lasted 3 years, it never officially ended. Dooley Bin Bin challenged senior police by asking, how much room you got in your jails? We'll fill them all. The strike was about much more than 30 shillings a week for wages and better conditions. They began agitating for rights, dignity and proper entitlements in their own country. In order to survive away from the stations, the mob established their own camps. They traded kangaroo and goat skins. Under Don McLeod's direction, they began alluvial mining with Yandis, like a Coolamon, until they could afford equipment. Ironically, their successful mining operations drew attention to the mineral wealth of the Pilbara. They supported themselves this way for over 20 years, acquired 3 stations, established schools, teaching the local language and developing a way of life based on Aboriginal communal organisation. The mob had solid supporters like the Communist Party, some of the churches, particularly the Anglican Church, women's groups and a small group of artists. The Fremantle branch of the Seamen's Union refused to load the squatters' wool on boats while the strike was on, and eventually the Australian Workers' Union supported the mob's claims for wages and better conditions. When West Australia was first established as a state by the settlers, the Constitution made provision for a small percentage of state revenue to be allocated to Aboriginal people. McLeod turned bush lawyer and went on to argue that this had been illegally changed in the West Australian Constitution, and he continued to agitate for restitution. It was never achieved. He also went on to support other actions for justice for Aboriginal people, including the fight against oil drilling on Aboriginal land at Noonkanbah in the Kimberley region of West Australia in the late 1970s. At one level, the strike collapsed, but like the Eureka Stockade, it was a victory won from a battle lost. Many gains were made. There were also bitter disappointments and much obstruction by authorities, and the mob struggled to hold it all together. It's a blight on the history of our governments that failed to support this bold model. A little vision by governments could have seen a model evolve for remote communities. There are so many wonderful characters in this heroic story to celebrate for their incredible efforts against impossible odds as a small group of disempowered but dedicated people. Peter Coppin, the songman Donald Norman, Daisy Bindi, Ernie Mitchell, and so many more heroes that can take credit for giving birth to the Aboriginal land rights movement and inspiring the Gurindji walk-off at Wave Hill in the 1960s. In the foreword to Max Brown's book, Black Eureka, the writer Dorothy Hewitt wrote, "A little mob of Norwest Aborigines without status, funds or human rights challenged the feudal strongholds of squatters, missions, courts, newspaper barons and governments, all the way up to the United Nations. It is a classic story of the underdog and his uncountable resources. It records the birth of the militant Aboriginal movement, and it's part of Australian history now."